Hello, in this video I want to talk a little bit more about what I think about settler colonialism and the upcoming worker strike resolution for LD. I think that this is a really interesting topic area because I think it allows a really in-depth discussion of just the nature of like what a worker strike composes of and what the state's or what the government's relationship to resistance ought to be. And so I think there are a lot of really interesting questions to be raised in the context of this resolution, and I'm having a really good time talking about the settler colonialism kind of strand of stuff that I'm doing for this portion of the resolution, and hopefully you are too. If you haven't, I would definitely go back and look at the last couple of videos that I've done talking about settler colonialism and the worker strike, because I definitely think they'll be integral to the stuff that we're doing in this video. In the intro video, I talked a little bit about what I thought just generally in terms of what I think the premise are for a lot of the best arguments that contain like arguments about settler colonialism in relationship to the worker strike, whether it be normative critiques of Marxism or just a critique of the sovereign relationship to resistance in the first place. And I definitely think that's really important to kind of get the framework for what I'll be talking about in this video, which is how do we take those and think about ways in which policy teams can better respond to settler colonialism on this resolution, because I definitely think that this is an argument that you'll have to be prepared for and something that you should expect coming as a set of arguments that can be made against like reasons why the worker strike itself are bad or why the state's recognition of the worker strike could be bad. And so I definitely want to kind of just lay out in this video what some of the priorities are and how those priorities kind of frame how you should be thinking about some of the more particular portions of the debate, whether it be the framing portion of the debate, the thesis, the linked debate, permutation, impact comparison, alternative, etc. So in this video, I just want to start off, like I said, talking a little bit about just some of the priorities that I think are really important to how you're kind of structuring this argument. I think that when you're trying to figure out what some of the best policy responses are to settler colonialism on this topic, I think the most important thing is really framing the way in which you're reading the resolution. I think that this resolution is definitely has some pretty weird wording to it in the way in which it talks about like a morally just state should be able to, like for instance, recognize the worker strike. I feel like this brings into a lot of questions of like what different morphings of the state could look like and what different ways in which the sovereign can be retooled in order to change the ways in which it relates to colonial power and how colonial power is enforced or mimicked in various ways. I think that you could also have really interesting debates about things like tribal sovereignty in relationship to the worker strike as well, and talk about how the state kind of works at multiple functions and how the kind of like example, for instance, of how tribal sovereignty would operate in the context of the worker strike could envision a more like textual or detailed or intersectional understanding of how violence happens in various types of communities and the way in which that violence can be kind of like resolved by the state's kind of like use of various types of like policies at different capacities. I think that being able to frame a lot of these as like core central questions for how you're able to think out maybe examples of what the resolution could look like and the ways in which the worker strike can maybe get out of some of these kind of like core link concerns that really frame the concerns that the negative team wants to make in a lot of these debates, then you have a really interesting place to kind of like start off a lot of the things that you'll kind of like want to really go into on later on in the debate. And I also think that a lot of the arguments that you kind of want to focus on secondary to that is what is the question of like how the alternative is able to basically create a world in which there is like ways in which resistance can spill up into creating structural changes to the ways in which settler colonialism inevitably like creates this kind of like presence over the way in which we understand our relationship to politics in the world, and what does that mean in terms of like how the alternative kind of like necessitates things like a form of institutional engagement, the grammar of institutional demands, etc., in order to make a lot of the things that it's kind of like articulating as like necessary demands as like smart and kind of the places where you really want to situate offense. I think that then when you kind of like and go from there, a lot of the stuff that you really want to start using those priorities to use starting on your framework portion of the debate is what are the ways in which you can basically weigh in which the kind of like the advantages of the plan text outside of whether or not the kind of like epistemological basis remains invested in like this sovereign and like this kind of like vague capacity. What does that mean in terms of like the ability for the worker strike or the recognition of the worker strike to alleviate immediate impacts that create like various types of proximate violence, but also forms of like magnified violence to the exact impacts the negative is talking about. I think that all of this can be done through like normative framework interpretations that a lot of policy teams use in terms of talking about why just weighing the affirmative is important. But I think that a lot of the things that you really want to kind of like sit on in these types of resolutions is being able to win the education that comes from having in-depth debates about why being able to like organize demands and create specific kind of like understandings of like legal formations of like what the state could look like and how that can change the ways in which we imagine various different futures for what the state could be are important to the way in which we're able to sustain a vision for like what education looks like in terms of debate and like why debate is kind of like good in order to produce those types of education. I definitely think that a lot of the stuff that you can kind of like take from these framing portions questions becomes useful as you continue to cross-apply throughout the rest of the debate. And I think that the thing that also allows you to set up is very important arguments about the relationship between some of the link arguments and their relationship to the government as like and their relationship to the state as it exists in the status quo, but maybe not in the world in which they're theorizing like the possibility or the condition of the plan, which even if that means like the judge shouldn't assume like the most perfect version of the plan, it does mean that there isn't this kind of like structural inevitability to like settler colonialism making policy like impossible or the state's capacity impossible because of the way in which the resolution itself kind of opens up the possibility for a differential view of how we should kind of relate to these questions and like what the state could be overall. I then think that when you move this over into the thesis portion of the debate, I think this is where you kind of start applying a lot more of that kind of like first priority that I was talking about earlier in the video. I think the best way to kind of like attack these debates head on from like the get-go is to really talk about like a really example-based debate about the ways in which the question of like what a state could be is not only the question of like the USFG Strait, or as a lot of their link cards would think about the relationship to the sovereign and the way in which they're studying them historically, but it's a question of like what are the ways in which various types of sovereign entities and institutions that have the capacity to create law, what is their relationship to like movements of resistance and the way in which those movements are able to make them like culpable and responsible for the types of violence that happens under various forms of like wage labor that spill into various other kind of like critical impacts that I think you can just discuss obviously throughout whatever affirmative that you're reading. I then think that with that, along with the strong development of why the particular examples of like when these types of different sovereign institutions take different shapes, the kind of different relationship that movements have to take to them gets a little bit more complicated. It isn't as simple as being able to like make a simple refusal and not be able to participate in the actual kind of like legible demand to create change in the context of a lot of these areas. And so I feel like as you kind of like contextualize and make more details to the types of examples that you're giving, the easier it will be able to kind of like make strong thesis arguments that not only are kind of like participating and being able to frame the kind of like most important arguments that'll come later on in the debate, but also kind of put a lot of pressure onto the negative team to really make a stronger extrapolation of the link arguments in the block that goes beyond being able to just like reiterate the history of like why various forms of domestic forms of colonialized relationships to the state are bad, and making an actual argument about like the sovereign at a theoretical capacity, which I think is a lot higher standard for like the articulation of like how the link looks like in any world of the affirmative, which I think is a lot harder thing for negatives to win on a resolution like this. Hopefully this video is helpful as a kind of beginner to what I'm thinking about what some of the policy responses to settler colonialism could be on this resolution, and hopefully it'll keep seeing for more. As always, thank you.